I'm here today with the Reverend Canon Kelly Brown Douglas. Kelly is the canon theologian at the Washington Cathedral. In 2017, she was named Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And in 2019, she was appointed to the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union. Kelly is considered a leader in the field of womanist theology, racial reconciliation, social justice, and sexuality in the Black Church. Prior to joining the Cathedral and EDS at Union, she was the Susan D. Morgan Professor of Religion at Goucher College in Baltimore. Previously, she was the Associate Professor of Theology at Howard University School of Divinity and Assistant Professor of Religion at Edward Waters College. Dr. Douglas was one of the first 10 Black women to be ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church, and she was an associate priest at Holy Comforter Episcopal Church in Washington for more than 20 years. Her latest book is Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. So Kelly, it's really a privilege and honor to have you join us here today. Thanks so much for that.
Well, it's my privilege, and thank you for inviting me into this conversation, Brian.
Well, you've got such an impressive background. So before we dive into the book, could you please tell us a little bit about, the different steps you've had along the way?
Oh, my goodness. How really a long journey, but not so long journey. I'm originally from Dayton, Ohio, born and raised there. And as we like to say in the Episcopal Church, a cradle Episcopalian. And I guess when I think about sort of the steps along the way, as you put it, in my journey, and I've written about this in some places, it really does begin for me in Dayton and in my church there, which was St. Margaret's Episcopal Church, a Black Episcopal church in Dayton. Dayton was a very segregated city and not very diverse, segregated Black and white. And so the west side of Dayton was typical, whatever was the west side was where African Americans lived. But I remember one day when I was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, was going downtown, if you will, with my parents, which meant that we had to go through Dayton's so-called inner city or urban area. And I remember looking out the window. It was on a cold, rainy evening. And I looked out the window and I saw 2 little kids crossing the street. And I imagined them about my age. I imagined them as brother and sister. And I saw them, and they weren't dressed for the weather. And so in my mind, these were poor kids that didn't have all that they should have as children. And I remember crying. I was sitting in the back of this car, and I remember crying. And I made a vow to myself, Brian, to my 7 or 8 year old self, that one day I was going to come back and get those children. Now, as a 7 or 8 year old, I thought that they would stay young, I would get older, and I could literally come back and get those children. But what didn't change over time was my accountability to those children. And so that from that point on, I knew whatever I would end up doing in life, that I was accountable to those children, and to find a way to change conditions so that children like those would not have to be trapped in the kind of conditions that foster not life, but really death. I brought that together with my love for the church. I went to church every Sunday as much as I could. Even when my parents weren't going, I would wake them up and tell them to take me to church, much to the dismay of my siblings. They would do this to me, like, you better not take us to church. But to make a long story short, I loved hearing stories about Jesus. And what I loved most was hearing the stories of Jesus, this little baby being born in a manger. And I couldn't imagine how one would allow a child to be born in a barn, in a manger. But over time, I brought together Jesus in that manger with those children. that I saw. And I guess I was making theological connections before I even knew what the word theology was, which I didn't really know about until I went to college. But it was those two things that really drove my life and the path that I ended up taking, and truly seeking ways to be accountable to those children and coming to understand that what it meant for me and my faith was indeed, it meant being accountable to those children and able to understand the relationship, if you will, that Jesus had to those who were trapped in what I now understand to be sort of crucifying realities. And so
Mhm.
that's
Hmm.
the journey that I took was one driven by that.
Well, good for you. I mean, isn't it amazing how these things get instilled in us at an early age in terms of the motivations or directions in our lives?
And we don't even in so many respects understand them until we can look back and see it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because who I certainly wasn't, I didn't know anything about theology, and so I didn't grow up saying, "Oh, I can't wait to be a theologian." What? Uh, and I certainly had no expectation of being a priest because one, girls, when I was little, girls weren't even allowed to serve as acolytes,
Hmm.
let alone women as priests. So that was never an expectation. Though as I sort of look back, you can see that trajectory. And so it's not surprising to many that I would end up being a priest.
And being one of the first,
Yeah.
first African American women priests, right? I mean,
Yeah, of course, Polly Murray was the first African American woman to be a priest, and I think I was amongst the first 10.
yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it's a groundbreaking thing. I mean, I mean, it's amazing. It's impressive. It's wonderful to see. At least some things have changed for the better. But as we were discussing earlier, we have a long ways to go.
Yeah, and we do have a long ways to go. And I just always say, Martin Luther King Jr. made famous, if you will, the saying that actually came from Theodore Parker, that the arc of the universe bends toward justice. And it's a long arc. But what I always say is, you know what, we may not get to that place of perfect justice, but at least we've got to get onto the arc. And so our job, and I see my sort of responsibility is to get on the arc, and I might, not do that. Well, I know not might, I not perfect and will make mistakes, but at least, make them for the right reason because you're fighting for justice. And so we've got a long way to go. The arc is long, but let's at least get on it.
I feel exactly the same way. So let's talk about writing. A lot of the folks in our audience are aspiring or established spiritual writers. So maybe tell us a little bit about that part of your journey. How did you get started writing things?
Yeah, it's like amazing. If I confess, Brian, every time I write a book, I'm like, what am I doing? What do I think I'm doing? And would have never imagined that I would have written one book, let alone the books that I have written. But for me, it really is a part of a journey, and writing has been a way for me to really explore the questions of my faith. And in this regard, Anselm, 11th century theologian, said that theology is faith seeking understanding. And for me, that's what the journey's been about. Really trying to understand my faith and what it means for me as a Black woman, and moving through the different contradictions of faith, and the questions that sometimes lead me to the brink of existential despair or no faith. And so in each instance, the books that I've written have emerged out of deep questions that I've had about the church, about faith, whether it be sexuality and the Black church. And when I wrote that book, I was at this point where, as I said, my best friend that I called my cousin loved the church, and it didn't love him back because he was gay. And what I was clear about was that I could not be a part of a tradition or a church that would in any way reject another human being because of who they were or who they were not. And I was convinced, even before I wrote that book, that everybody that has breath or has ever had breath is a child of God. And I was convinced, even before I wrote that book, that God's creation has never been a binary creation, and including God's human creation. So, but it was a struggle to figure out, how am I going to stay within a faith tradition and within a church that actually discriminates against, and that's putting it mildly, persons who are non-binary or queer. So the same, as each of my books, there's been a question that has really challenged me and my faith and who I am. And so that's what I've pursued in my writing. And it's through writing. Other people, there are artists who do it through their artwork and other modes. And I do it through writing. And while it's a solitary venture, it's, always in mind with sort of in relationship to wider world questions. And then, I always think, oh, if, I do it, and if someone gets something else from it that's meaningful, then I'm grateful, and I'm humbled by that. And I'm humbled that anyone cares about what I write.
Well, several of the authors that I deal with, particularly, quite frankly, some of the best, start their books at the same point that you're describing, is a question or a set of questions that they have on some particular area. And that's what they want to research. That's what they want to explore. That's what they want to dig deeper on. And then as they're developing all that, they're learning themselves and evolving their own beliefs and their own, and it helps both the writer and the audience, the folks that learn from what the writer has journeyed through. Yeah. So, I think that's a really effective avenue for, causing change, quite frankly.
Well, I hope so, but you're right. For me, it's always a journey and seeking answers to a question and discovering new questions, even in the process of that journey, and always discovering things that are new, and oftentimes not knowing where I'm going to end up. In the writing of the book, it certainly was the case with the book prior to Resurrection Hope, Stand Your Ground, and it was the case with Stand Your Ground. With Resurrection Hope, I, didn't know where I was going to end up. And as I sort of took this deep dive and trying to answer certain questions.
Yeah, so let's talk about Resurrection Hope, the latest book. What was the motivation? What was the question behind that book that drove you to write that?
Yeah, this was a different book. Since I think two things. I was driven primarily by not simply who I was as a theologian, but who I was as a mother to this young adult, Black male adult. And my son, he's now 28, we often carry forward text conversations, because his generation texts, and oftentimes would also come off of text because of the intensity of the questions that he was asking or the conversation. And I just, as we've moved through this time of this reemergence of such virulent anti-Blackness and anti-Black white supremacist racism, and through this time of Black Lives Matter protests, just trying to get to a place where Black Lives Matter, um, my son would ask these really not simply poignant questions, but wrenching questions
Mm.
of, basically, do you ever think there'll be a time when Black Lives Matter? Or questions, I remember the conversation we had when Philandro Castile was killed by police over a traffic stop. And I remember when my son texted me and said, okay, so Philandro did everything that was right. Uh, uh, Hands on steering wheel, told the police officers that he had a gun, that he was reaching for, all the things that Black parents typically tell their Black children as strategies for not only getting around, but dealing with the police, that we had told my son. And Desmond said he did everything that was right. So now what are we supposed to do? Questions like those
Wow.
push me to say, you know what? He wasn't asking for some sort of flippant, simple answer, but really asking about a question about his own existence in this country. And if this was a country that he could exist in. Yeah, I've always been concerned for his safety as a Black man. 6 foot, now he's 6 foot with locks. Always concerned about his safety, but this is a different question. And, for a parent, and for a parent, and when your kids are not feeling safe and they're having these deep questions about their own existence and reality, as well as these deep questions of faith, he asked me, I get it. And it really was the questions he was putting to me that motivated me to write this book and say, I've got to find answers. And his questions became my own. I not only have to find answers for him, but for myself. Because his questions pushed me to the brink of despair, let alone what was going on in our society. It's like, oh my gosh, from not only, Trayvon, from the Oscar Grant and on this from Emmett Till, this trajectory, Tamir Rice, Rekia Boyd, when is this going to end? And so my son asked those questions and I said, I need to find the answers.
Wow. So would you say the book is targeted for other people like your son then, or some other audience?
Well, I think that it's targeted for people who have Black people on the one, well, and people who have these questions of faith and despair and hope. Where does one's hope come from in a time like this? And how are we to understand where we are? And let me change that, because it's not targeted for a Black audience, because I truly address in this book the realities of anti-Blackness. And I remember my son asking the question when my bishop in Washington, D.C., who's also a very good friend of mine, and I respect very much deeply. But I remember him asking the question when she, of course, sort of responded to then President Trump's going during the Black Lives Matter protests, going in front of, if we will recall, the church, St. John's Episcopal Church, and held up a Bible. And she responded to that with outrage. And I remember my son asking, then he said, I get it, and that's a good thing. Her protesting Trump going in front of the church, but where are they? Where have those white folks been when we were being killed, et cetera, et cetera? Why are they protecting a church but not us? And so, I had to answer that question. And so it's also a book written, as I call, for those trying to understand those good white Christians and calling them out. So I think that the audience for this book is an audience of people who really care about the kind of nation and people we are and who we can become. And so that's who I think this book is written for, and asking those hard questions about who we are, how we got here, and those hard questions of faith, and not taking hope as a frivolous automatic thing.
So during the pandemic,
if that makes sense.
yeah. No, I mean, it's wonderful to dive into this, with you. During the pandemic, I've been reading a lot myself, a little more time on my hands to do that. A lot of good books about racial justice and anti-racism and reparations, things like that. How would you describe your book as unique from the other books that have been written in, similar kinds of areas?
Yeah, good question. And thanks for that question. One, I think because it is set up by a dialogue between a mother and a son, and trying to answer the questions that I think everyday people, the dialogue between a mother and a son, a Black mother and a son, those dialogues that other people have. It's also not prescriptive in that regard. This is not a book about how to be an anti-racist. It's not a how-to book at all. It is a book that tries to take seriously the realities of what it means to not simply be Black in a society that is anti-Black, how to be faithful in a society that is antagonistic to your very values, and how to hold on to that faith. But it's a book that takes seriously the doubts and the fears and the despair that people have. And while it is deeply sort of research, trying to understand sort of anti-Blackness, because as I begin, what is, my son asks these questions and we see Black lives always under assault. And even if, just a Black person bird watching becomes under assault, that I came to understand it's about more than simply white supremacy. It's about a narrative of anti-Blackness in this country, and to kind of try to understand where that came from deeply, even understanding why these Confederate monuments are on the public square. So it's a book that brings together, I think, deep research, but in a way that responds to the questions that I think, particularly people who are concerned for justice, but the questions between a Black mother and her son. And I've tried to write it in a way that is very accessible to people, so they can pick it up and I think see themselves in it in some way or the other.
So Reverend Michael Curry made a few comments about the book. Surprise, surprise. But one of the things he said was, by addressing head-on the pervasive anti-Black aspects inherent not only in the national ideology, but also in much of our Christian theology, Kelly Brown Douglas offers a powerful, deeply personal answer to the question of what it will take for Black life to truly matter in this country, and for God's just future to become a reality for all. That's a really powerful statement. So what will it take for Black life to truly matter in this country?
Yeah, we have to expand our moral imaginary of what justice looks like and what's possible. And what I mean by that, when we speak of our moral imaginary, it's almost that that sort of instinct, that sort of for justice, for injustice, even how we enact justice and how we see injustice. In order to do that, one of the things I really came to appreciate in writing this book is that we have to somehow change the narrative gaze in this country. That all that we know, all that we see, the way we know, the way we see, is refracted through this white way of knowing. We have to somehow get beyond that and change that gaze. Because that white way of knowing is a way of knowing that sustains this kind of white supremacist, anti-Black culture, society that we find ourselves a part of. That means that these conversations, and in fact, it's why this conversation that has become a conversation about critical race theory, and the people that are opposed to it don't know what it is, but it's why it's not an academic conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're really talking about is changing, opening up, if you will, the way in which people see the world, see this country, see our history,
Mm-hmm.
the way in which we see reality.
Mm-hmm.
And until we can change that and open that up so that we don't have this white normative way of knowing and adjudicating justice and what's right and what's not right, until we can change that and change that gaze, which will allow us to expand our moral imaginary, then we aren't going to be at a place where Black lives will ever matter.
Well, your book is an important contribution to the deeper thought, and I'm hoping that, through some of our efforts, we'll share it beyond the Black community and into, the communities, the white community in particular, that needs to hear some of this stuff. So,
well, I thank you for helping to do that, and I do, because without being sort of self-serving, I do think that the conversations that I had with my son, that the journey that the book takes us through, I do think is one that perhaps for those who pick it up will bring new insight, I hope, and at least provoke the kind of conversations with others and conversations with themselves that will help people to see things and at least at some point go, huh.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking
I'm
as
contributing to, I'm either I am or am not contributing to a future where Black lives will matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, just as speaking as a parent myself, I mean, I didn't have to go through those kinds of conversations with my daughters. There's other things we'd worry about, but not the kinds of things that you and your son had to worry about. And, so that right there, right, as a white person who raised kids, I've got something to learn that I didn't experience. So how can I understand, right? I mean, until somebody really explains it with any kind of depth. So that's just one small example.
Thank you. I know, but I think that's right. And, I often say, I know the conversations that we have to have with our children about just trying to navigate a world that does not foster their life. But there's conversations that are missing. I want to know what the conversations are that are going on or not going on between white parents and their children. Mm-hmm. Because hopefully maybe this book will help them have a different kind of conversation, because until they have a different kind of conversation, again, we are not going to be at a place where Black lives will matter in this country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so just like with every author that I speak with, I have to ask if there's any future books, that you're able to talk about. What are the upcoming questions that you feel like you want to wrestle with?
Yeah, the interesting thing is with each of my books, while they clearly leave unanswered questions, and I even look back and say, oh, I wish I knew this when I wrote that. But Brian, the truth of the matter is that I don't know what the next book will be. I could have never predicted that I would have written this book. And in fact, after I wrote Stand Your Ground, I said, and there's no more books in me. And so I don't know, because they really are organic for me. What I do know is that I will continue to try to stay on this arc that bends toward justice, and it's a justice where Black lives will matter. And that I do know. And that my task is to create a world where my son's children and their children will not have to ask their parents, will Black lives ever matter? That is my passion and my commitment. And I know that I am able to be in this conversation with you, to write books, to do what I'm doing now as a Black person, because my grandparents and my great-grandparents and those who came before me and my enslaved forebears, they stayed on the ark. And not because they thought realities would change for them, but because they didn't want their children and their children's children to be enslaved. They didn't want their children and their children's children to worry about being lynched, etc. And so what I can say to you is I don't know what the next book will be, but I know that I'm going to stay on this journey. And so that my son's children won't have to ask him, will there ever be a time when Black lives will matter?
That's really an excellent way to think of all of this, Kelly. Let's all try to stay on the arc. And thank you for your work to help us stay there.
And thank you.
So again, the name of the book is Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. It's available from Orbis Books. So highly recommend that you check it out. Kelly, thanks again so much for joining us. Really a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Brian.